Hi, Tatiana. So I'd like to just quickly review your mind map with you. So you have as your central theme, your topic is the central line dressing changes for students in a skills lab. And I want to start with cognitivism. So the theory of cognitivism explained here and also in your written explanation on the discussion board doesn't really fully extract the full meaning of cognitivism. So cognitivism thinks of a brain like a computer, I think is the best way to describe it. So it's not only what you have here is the view of knowledge must have a basic understanding of information, but the view of knowledge from a cognitivist standpoint would be that knowledge is processing. It's a process like computing, right? And that although clear instruction is important and reinforcement, not necessarily positive reinforcement, that's more behavioralism, but that the information needs to be presented not only clearly, but in a very distinct, defined process that is then meaningful for the learners, right? That is meaningful to learn that particular content in that context. So when you think of cognitivism, think about how a computer thinks would work, right? And that brains in cognitivism are thought of as similar to a computer, right? So you would need structure, you would need clear instruction, right? And you would need that purposeful knowledge acquisition to go kind of from one step to another. Sort of, again, how we think about computers, right? How we would think that is. How information is received, organized, stored, and then retrieved again. And in this case, by the mind of our students, right? So it's very important then the process of how these things are shown to the learner, right? And thinking that if you show step 1, 2, and 3 in sequence, that's very important, rather than showing all the steps all together, right? So that it needs to be organized in sequence, right? In a way that learning is understandable and meaningful to the learner. So I didn't feel as though you captured that aspect of cognitivism. So when we go down here to constructivism or constructivist theories, I was gonna move that over, but I can't. I agree. Brunner is one of our theorists in that particular realm. Knowledge is constructed, hence the name of the theory, by the student, and new knowledge is applied, right, to enhance further understanding by applying that knowledge, constructing that knowledge based on the basis, the bricks that we already have, right? The view of the learner is new information and acknowledge the new information and then interpret that new information. But to extend that, the rest of the view of the learner is onto already understood concepts and knowledge, right? So you can't have constructivists, you can't have construction if you don't have something to build upon, right? So you can't build a building without a ground to build it on or without a base, right? You can't build, if you're looking at a house, you can't build a house unless you have some sort of foundation, whether that's a basement or a brick foundation or something like that. So you need to build on that other information, and that's what I found you were lacking here in this description of the learner for constructivism. And then you look at the role of the educator, right? Encouraging them to discover new principles. Well, we want to always encourage our students to discover new principles, and we also want to organize information and engage those students in dialogue and debrief, of course, but you also want to, as the educator, find out where your students are coming from, right? So I don't know what I can build upon in your learning until I know what you kind of already know, right? What you already understand, things that you're already familiar with. So for example, if I was going to be using a constructivist lens, and I was thinking about a group of younger students, we'll say a group of third graders, right? I can arguably say that young people in third grade would know the alphabet, right? A, B, C, D, all the way to Z, right? So I could, if I was creating an assignment that had to do with a process, right? And it would say a scientific process, I would say something like this. Scientific processes are just like the alphabet. You have the letter A first, that would be step 1. You have the letter B second, that would be step 2 in our scientific process. So kind of showing them that there's a pattern, right, to the processes of scientific discovery, just like there's a pattern in the alphabet or a pattern in numeracy, right? Numbers from 1 to 10, right? So taking that concept that the students already understand and that there's a similar sequence, right, for the alphabet and for numbers, right? And then looking at a sequence, right, sequencing in scientific experimentation or sequencing in genetics, right? If I were pushing it forward, I don't know if I'd be teaching third graders genetics, but I think you understand what I mean. Again, building on that knowledge we already understand, right? And our students already know that we arguably say they should already know, right? And then how this theory informs the skills in the simulation, providing that step-by-step instruction, of course, asking questions before and after, right? Before is very important. After is to see if they actually gain some new knowledge, but before is very important because if you ask beforehand, we say we're going to do a central line dressing change. When I'm talking about a central line dressing change, where would that line be? And if everybody points to their hand, right, thinking that a peripheral IV is a central line, then you've got some building to do, right? You've got some constructing to do from a foundational level, right? So that makes sense. Okay, so next we're going to look at the humanistic theory that you have here. Rogers is absolutely experimental. That's fine. That's a humanistic theory. Utilize knowledge to become autonomous. Yes, that's what we want our learners to do, right? To be autonomous learners and autonomous in their practice. A personal act to fulfill potential. That's the view of the learner. Well, it's a little bit more than that, right? So when we're looking at humanistic theory, we're looking at that learner's self-efficacy, right? They're wanting to fulfill their potential, in other words. So it's not just a personal act, it's being personally responsible, shall we say, in fulfilling their potential in their learning, right? The role of the student, a lot of their learning is self-directed, right? And self-evaluation, that is correct. And you are definitely a facilitator in humanistic theory, right? As the educator, right? Allowing students to self-evaluate in clinical lab is absolutely essential for this type of theory, and to decompress prior to or after performance of the skill. I'm not quite sure where you're going there. If you mean perhaps debrief instead of decompress, I'm wondering, or are you talking about a stress response, like were they nervous or anxious? But debriefing would definitely be part of that if you're looking at a skills lab. So kind of like a pre-conference, post-conference type of structure. But in simulation, we would talk about debriefing so that students could kind of process through what they did. So maybe that's what you meant, not decompress, but debriefing. So think about that. And then behaviorism, right? Behaviorism is definitely Skinner. Knowledge is based on behavior. Knowledge is actually constructed based on behaviors. So it's not, knowledge isn't based on behavior, but knowledge is constructed based on the behaviors and trying to gravitate more toward positive behavior, right? Or something that you're going to be rewarded for versus a negative stimuli or negative feedback from a behavior, right? So, or punishment. And the view of the learner is that, well, the view of the learner is not learners learn through positive and negative feedback. The view of the learner is positive and negative feedback that's provided by the environment, by the educational environment, right? and not that they learn, but that they are, well, yeah, they learn, they acquire knowledge through positive and negative feedback. The role of the student is to perform that task correctly, or to garnish positive feedback and limit or eliminate the number of negative feedback points that they get within an educational environment, right? The educator is to reinforce that behavior or that action or that outcome, right? And arrange the environment absolutely for the desired response. The role of the educator is also to, if you think about it, provide positive feedback, positive stimuli, and also provide negative stimuli, or not negative feedback, but negative, to not support those negative behaviors, right? So it's either eliminating feedback at all times when a student would do something that's incorrect. So if a student were to do a correct or perform a task correctly, with, this particular example of central line dressing, you would say, oh, that was very well done, Joe. You put that, you maintained sterility during the entire dressing change. And then where James didn't do that, you wouldn't give him any feedback at all, right? So that is also part of a behavioral theory, is that you would not give any feedback to someone who is not doing that process correctly, right? You would just, they would know, because they didn't get that type of positive reinforcement, that they needed to change. They unfortunately wouldn't know what to change, but they would know that they hadn't done it right. And so that can go to the extreme. Not necessarily my favorite educational theory. And how that works in simulation, right, and skills lab. Allowed monitored skills. Okay, so I'm wondering how allowing monitored skills lab and simulation hours with an instructor would go. Because if you're truly looking at a behavioralism theory, it would always be monitored, right? You would always have someone there telling students whether they're doing right or wrong, whether it was verbally or, it might even be computer modulated, where during a module, they were, working within the module, and then, if they got questions wrong, they get a big red X across the screen or something like that. I think it's not just allowing the monitored skill stations and hours with an instructor, with someone to provide feedback. It would be always having someone there. And extra point in class, or getting a good grade and demonstrating stall dressing change. Well, we want all of our students to have good outcomes, right? And the opposite of that, right, for the skills lab would be that negative reinforcement, right? So positive reinforcement is one part of this theory, but also that you got that incorrect, or that deduction of points or things like that is part of that theory as well. And you want to think about, when you're doing that in the clinical environment, and how you actually want to leverage this theory if you're actually thinking about using it. Because oftentimes students need repetition when they're learning skills. And sometimes that negative feedback, or as people call it, negative feedback or negative reinforcement, doesn't allow students to want to excel or want to try new things and things like that. They become very fearful, and it can become anxiety producing. So we want to just be careful in the way that we utilize some of these theories. So hopefully that feedback was helpful to you. If you have any questions, please email me.